Well, thanks a lot. I speak in English because I did the presentation in English, so I'm sorry for the ones. Anyway, first a short statement of warning, and because I'm not talking about one specific museum, I also will not be very specific about peculiarities of what we should do about a museum in society. I did all this before, which you can look up somewhere else. I'm really like to talk more about a specific project that just finished last year, which is a City of Space of Possibility. It's a study of Stadt als Möglichkeitsraum in German. It's a study of actors of urban development, a case study actually in the city of Hanover. And so this is just a short presentation. By the way, just in case you want to know it, I have the book with me, and it's available. Anyway, this short presentation is based on the empirical findings of a project that we did in Hanover about the cultural and artistic actors of sustainable urban development in that city. This project, Stadt als Möglichkeitsraum, City as Space of Possibility, has asked about the variety and the effectiveness of urban cultural actors for sustainable urban development. How much are museums and theaters now part of this sustainable urban development? How much can they be actors and a resource in a big city and a space for a visionary urban development? Can museums help to start a visionary urban development? Are they even a place of possibility themselves? Or can they be an actor in this urban development? And what is it? A visionary, sustainable urban development. And how could a museum contribute to this answer? A museum and actually also other cultural institutions like theaters. We talked about alternative subcultural spaces too, but due to the 10 minutes I thought I have, I just focus on this one museum and on one theater, which are actually these two places I talk about. The Historical Town Museum and the State Theater. Both are really big institutions, especially the State Museum, the State Theater in Hanover there are about seven different stages all over the city. It's not just in the center of it. The Town Museum is much smaller, but anyway, it's still quite important. And I certainly have a normative orientation about them, and a request that I actually directed to these institutions when I talked to them, when we talked to them. I say I, but we were a group of about 10, 12 people for a 4-year project where we looked at the institutions as actors of a sustainable urban development. We thought, very normative, that museums and theaters have to function as spaces for this sustainable urban development. They have to support whatever sustainable urban development they think is sustainable urban development. Let me shortly outline first the concept of possibility that I use here. It is based on a contemporary theory about utopias that has been developed by the American sociologist Eric Olin Wright in 2007. It has been published in 2010 in the United States and has been actually, sorry, it's much too early, published in German, translated into German in 2017 with Surkamp. For Wright, a real utopia is a concretation of possibilities between desirability and practicability. After the bank crash of 2008, a lot of, especially of American sociologists, became interested and became actually fascinated with critical utopian concepts, saying that this is a time we should probably think about a different society. For example, the American organizational sociologist Michael Burroway wrote in 2016, and this is the quote, I just read it, "I think it is very important to think about alternative worlds. After the 2008 crisis, some people thought there would be a restructuring in capitalism, but no. The wave of marketization that began in the 1970s, for the most part, continues. So in these circumstances, it seems very important to develop alternative imaginations to what could be, because the capitalist world of today has an unprecedented capacity to make us believe that it cannot be otherwise." I would add towards this quote that, for instance, the climate crisis is another event that should doubt us about the ever-healing power of the free market. So, Erik Olin Wright, 2010, 2017 in German, formulates an emancipative alternative to contemporary capitalism with his concept of the real utopias. I cannot really go into it too much. These are big sociology books where he also brings a lot of examples. It's not just that this is an abstract delineation of sociological thought, but he went into the world for, it's a 30-year project he did. He unfortunately died 2 years ago. So what he did is he went all over the world and looked at projects that are a part of real utopias. Again, what are real utopias for him? At the center of social change, he emphasizes the mutual control of the market, of the state, and of civil society. All three of them have to control each other. Radical, democratic, egalitarian, and emancipative visions can contribute to a renewed social empowerment, he says, and he brings, as I just said, many examples for this possible realignment of power between the market state and civil society. Basically, the creation of a real utopia demands answers to 3 questions. First, what do we want? Desirability. Second, what is viable, or other people would say feasible. And third, what is achievable under the current institutional and political situations, the barriers. The difference between a visionary dream and a real utopia is the step from desires to a systematic implementation of a social transformation. By the way, this is not really so new, because after I looked into another book which happened to be published 60 years before, 55, 60 years before, The Principle of Hope by Ernst Bloch already brought up these ideas. So he used it, reformulated it, and he put it into a modern environment, let's say it this way, a nowadays environment. So the question I raise now is how much major cultural institutions, such a town museum or a state theater, can contribute to the implementation, can contribute to the finding and the formulation of visions. Then to the implementation, and then to the realization of these desires. Let's start with the Town Museum. Nothing special about this museum, definitely not. As a town museum, the Historical Museum Hanover collects, preserves, researches, and exhibits the history of the city from the 13th century onwards. The museum is located in a not very inviting brutalist architecture from the 1960s, and at the time of our survey, the exhibitions were closed, but supposedly they were open last year. They are still not open, so they work on it. Depends on the money that they don't have, so they're working still on the permanent exhibition and the reopening of it nowadays. Now, the interviewed executive that we interviewed developed a concept for this new exhibition, together with his team, certainly not only by himself, attempting to involve the Hanover public to be more a part of the development of this new permanent exhibition. His main focus is to increase the desire of the Hanoverians to participate more in the museum. However, since the museum is a municipal institution, it must abide to the rules of the city government. These regulations are considered restrictive by him and by others in the museum. Especially the many bureaucratic barriers erected by the government and the politicians limit any type of discussions about future visions and visions about the museum. Short quote, which I don't have here. Money is perhaps not the decisive issue. We are used to having not money. This sometimes leads to a bit of shirt-sleeved measures, creative solutions for our problems. Our main limitation is the lack of manpower. And then there are, of course, barriers such, for instance, small issues but not unimportant issues There's a city corporate design. You have to follow the corporate design of the city because the museum is a part of the city. It's part of a city department. And especially the non-creative layout of the city's website. They cannot create their own website because it's part of the rules. Since we are an administrative unit of the municipality, we are not allowed to have our own and more exciting web presentation. Since we are part of the city municipality, we are not allowed to start to have our own initiatives and practices without coming back to the main cultural department, and so on and so on. So the bureaucratic barriers seem to be like the ones that are really, really not helping him to create any new permanent exhibitions. There's another quote about this. This dependency on a restrictive work environment makes it difficult for creative thinkers in this museum to even think about desires and visions for the museum beyond the everyday existence. This is the quote. It's hard for me to describe a utopia for the museum. I'm so caught up in the daily fight about realistically achieving goals that other people have given us, that beyond that, frankly, I find it difficult to describe a vision. I'm so satisfied, laughs cynically, with this status that I couldn't tell you what I actually want beyond that. This is a professional deformation, or déformation professionnelle, he said in French. There are certain thought structures in these institutions from which one cannot escape. It would be very difficult for me to get radically out of this thinking structure to escape from it. The interview made him aware of these otherwise unconscious and thus very powerful limitations of thinking and acting as a part of the museum. Therefore, the interview and my persistent requests for visions. You really don't have a vision about this museum? Come on, there must be something that comes out of it. Made him possible for him then to playfully break out of the corset of bureaucratic thinking patterns and think about statements of an imagined desire that he might put into this museum. It took us a while, 2 hours actually, in the interview that he started to think about visions and really open up his heart about what he might want to do. And he has a high desire to improve this museum, that's for sure. My dream about this museum and about the role of this museum in this city is that we are the place, virtual, real, that brings together all discourses about the entity of the city. So, we are an agency, so to speak, that should help people to find answers to questions such as, what is the identity of the city? What is the character of the city? What does that have to do with me and the world I live in? He even has some more concrete examples that I didn't put in here now. After I started, all his ideas flow out of his mouth. It was all in him, but it was prohibited to talk about. However, as the museum employee and as an administrative officer of the municipality, he must immediately, and he did so, discipline and distance himself from his own fantasies, by stressing the higher importance of the higher significance of the factor viability. The contradictions between desirability and practicability are almost always solved to the benefit of viability, as Eric Olin Wright also describes it. The museum expert recognizes the cognitive dissonance between his visual thinking and his real behavior, but he gets no support or would even get sanctioned if he would pressure for a utopian solution. His imaginative is a disturbing and resource-consuming factor for every established institution with a taken-for-granted frame of attitudes and behavior patterns. And the administration of museums do not even need to punish their employees for thinking and then trying to realize fantasies, completely new and innovative processes and structures, because they are not even in their own mind allowing themselves to create these fantasies and these visions. So this is probably it was from all the institutions, and we did quite a lot of institutions, the one where you see the highest polarity, the highest contradiction, I would even say the highest schizophrenia, if I might use this word, between what these people might wish for the institution and what they can, and then having a censorship in their own mind, stopping to even think about utopian and visionary ideas, and taking them, burying them in the bureaucracy they're working in, because they don't want to lose their job, they don't want to be looked at being visionary in the probably worst sense of the word. Now, not as much, and that's, I thought it's interesting to look not only at a museum, but also at the theater for this short speech, not as much schizophrenic is the other high culture institution that I instituted, the Lower Saxony State Theater in Hanover. It can be described as one of the most successful theaters in Germany with 7 stages, not only in the city center, but also in the periphery of the city, spatially in the periphery, but also socially. The theater has a full-time employee for theater pedagogy and outreach programs, and a lot of part-time people also. This position is closely linked to the general dramaturgy, and there are strong and amiable relations among the theater pedagogy department, the theater director, and the main dramaturge. And when I did the interview with all 3 people. Let's start again with these issues of desirability, viability, and achievability as defined by Wright. Very fast, elements of desirability became a central theme in this interview. Not like with the museum guy, the theaters, people immediately jumped on the opportunity to talk about visions. For these people, all of them interested and familiar with experimental theater, utopian thinking is essential for their creative work and for the sense of communication with the audience. Topics of desirability are by far more important than issues of viability and practicability for them. It is important to these 3 experts to convey utopian ideas to the audience. Desirability is the common transgressive experience between the theater people and the audience. That's the quote. What vision can one develop for theater? Actually, theater is a playground and a think tank for the city where you can playfully create and attempt future ideas. This is the place for playful thinking, for visionary work. No doubt about it. The theater is, however, not only a heterotopian place of possibilities, but also a place to study utopian thinking and dystopian developments. But this close relationship between utopian discourse and theater practice is not only interesting for the philosophically educated theater director. Asked about the maintenance of high utopian standards under the existing financial limitations, economic utilitarizations, and possible external political interventions, and there are political interventions into the theater, the dramaturg replied with his autonomy, for instance, with the resilience of good theater work without extensive state support. The utopia of a community theater experience and corresponding visions and wishes are the central topics of the discussion, even in the main theater. Although all 3 theater professionals are aware of the limitations of everyday theater life, it still does not take over the thinking. As one of the most important high culture institutions of the federal state of Lower Saxony, the State Theater in Hanover is of great political importance. It has thus been integrated into the structures of power and elite from the very beginning on. Because it is under the observation of the supporting and sometimes not supporting political representatives, it is highly bureaucratically organized. Nevertheless, the theater remains experimental and utopian in at least one sector of the institution, the creative sector. The organizational sector of the theater administration is as much as possibly separated from the creative sector. So they have the solution is to really split these 2 halves. By this clear separation, the theater can remain a utopian space of possibility. The question remains how much the restriction of the bureaucratic and administration section affect the realization of desirability features on the other side. So what we have here is actually a variegated type. I do not want to talk too much about the other two types because I don't have the time, but we find three different types of actors. The bureaucratic type, the entrepreneurial, I would say the cultural entrepreneur type, and the variegated types that's kind of schizophrenic. And again, the variegated type is the one you find in the museum and in the theater, although in the museum you certainly find more the bureaucratic type, towards the bureaucratic type, whereas in the theater you find a variegated type that turns more to the entrepreneurial way. For all cultural institutions studied, issues of visions, desires, and utopias are not at the center of their agenda. The main topic of our conversation were the bureaucratic, fiscal, and sometimes political barriers of everyday life in the museum and theater. However, topics of desirability are still more important than topics of viability when you dip into the discussions and the thinking. Real utopias always oscillate between vision and pragmatism, each of which in its own way creates aspects of sustainable urban development. Again, I don't have the time to talk about what they thought about sustainable urban development, but that's not the topic of my talk today, really. A general finding of our research was an emphasis on visions and utopian imagination in weakly institutionalized organizations, and an emphasis on viability and achievability and bureaucracies, of course, in strongly institutionalized organizations. So certainly the Historical Museum and also the State Theatre are both highly formalized bureaucratic organizations with complex bureaucratic structures. From that side, no issues of desirability are rarely addressed. The two-track institutional context is important here. Only after repeated encouragement, the museum employee verbalized his utopian ideas. But this individual vision is immediately withdrawn because institutional rules discourage it. The creative employees of the State Theatre, however, are certainly freer to express their utopian ideas, but they are also in a complex relationship to the institution. But they still can emphasize their articulations, which are opposite to the ones of the theater administration. I postulate a comprehensive task for museums, namely to be ready and able not only to adapt to social environments, but to be able to actively and self-confidentially shape their environment by expressing visionary ideas. Expressing the sociologist Robert Merton, I have divided museums into 4 types, and I did a talk about in a paper about this somewhere else. The conventional type, which as an institution uses power-conforming means of social hegemony in order to realize the established and traditional goals of a powerful environment in a conformist manner. The ritual type, which also uses conformist means, but actually not because it likes it. It just does not want to mess with the elite. Then the innovative type, which approves of the established goals but tries to implement them with new and innovative means. And finally, the rebellious type, which as an institution neither approves of the established and traditional objectives nor of the usual means of implementation. Here, new goals, visions, desires are defined independently and also implemented with new means. So the question remains, which is the last question mark, how much the Linden Museums might be a rebellious museum? Okay, I leave it with this. Thank you.